joining us today at Chanticleer, virtually that is. We will be presenting today our PowerPoint, which will be led by David Mattern, Aaron Bertelsen, and Bill Thomas. So we'll be getting into introductions in just a moment, and I wanted to take a moment to say a few housekeeping notes. So today, May 8th, marks the start of National Public Gardens Day in the US, or National Public Gardens Week, rather. So from May 8th to May 17th, America's Public Gardens Association and all public gardens in the country are celebrating the value that public gardens bring to our communities and the work that they do. So I encourage you to search more about that on social media using the hashtag National Public Gardens Week. And thank you again for coming. I wanted to just mention Chanticleer and Great Dixter partner very often on educational programs. We've hosted Aaron Bertelsen twice now to speak about his books, most recently in February for his recent book, Grow Fruit and Vegetables in Containers. And we just really enjoy this sort of collaboration. So we felt like it was an exciting topic to bring to all of you today. This webinar is intended to be informal, and about half of it will be spent in a discussion format. And we want to engage with all of you participants by using the Q&A section on your Zoom platform. So as we go through the talk, you will be able to scroll up to the top, I believe it is, find Q&A, and be entering your questions there as you go along. So if you're inspired by something one of the speakers is saying and you have an immediate question, please record it as it comes up, and that's where we'll be taking your questions from. So I will now pass it over to Bill Thomas, Head Gardener and Executive Director at Chanticleer Garden. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Aaron, and good afternoon to everyone. We're very pleased to be working with Great Dixter on this, and I'm going to introduce our speakers, and they will each give an overview of their work with edibles, and then we'll go on to the questions and answers. Our two main speakers are Aaron Bertelsen, Great Dixter's vegetable gardener, and David Mattern, a Chanticleer horticulturist. So Aaron Bertelsen, would you like to start and tell us about your vegetable gardening at Great Dixter?
Thank you. It's fantastic to be here today on a sunny day here in England. And I'm just going to go through the kitchen courtyard at Great Dixter, the kitchen yard, and just tell you a bit about it, how it came about, and the inspiration for the book. Next. So this is an overview of looking down onto the kitchen yard, and it's on the northeast end of the house, leading from the kitchen door into the yard. Originally, not a lot happened in there. There was a pig kept in there for kitchen waste a long time ago. Nowadays we have wheelie bins, but it's just a sort of link between the house and the garden. Next. Back. Stop giggling. The thing I've got to think about for the yard in its use is that I've got to get the wheelie bins out once a week. So they've got to go out through and up the kitchen drive. There's also some steps leading down to the heating chamber, so that's got to be accessed. And also in the middle of the photo, you'll see there's a white line. That's the washing line. And so on a sunny day, we can hang washing on there. So they're the sort of everyday uses for the space. So I've got to think about these when filling it up with pots. Next. And that's looking up. There's the washing line and the wheelie bins and the door on the right in the middle of the photo. That's leading down to the heating chamber. The door on the right, on the bottom right of the photo, that's the kitchen door. That's the screen over the kitchen door to stop flies going in. So they're the sort of access points for the kitchen yard. Next. It's important because it's near the house to have some interest throughout the year. And in this photo, this is, you'll see the bleakness. It's the middle of winter. The leaves are off the peach tree, the apple tree. But there is some interest with things like the bay tree. There's a cordline, there's sage, there's rosemary, chard. So you've got to think about having some interest, because you'd never go out there and it's near the house. So you've got to have some interest to draw you out there. Next. And then by spring, we're really seeing things are changing there. You can see in the middle of the photo at the back, there's an apple tree in blossom. On the right-hand side, the peach tree has already had its blossom and is leafed up. And things like violas, there's lots of different things that are going on. The bay tree that you saw it was on the right-hand side of the photo originally, is now on the left-hand side. That's one of the joys for me having things in pots, is you can move them around throughout the year and have fun, you know, go out there in the evening with friends, have a few drinks, move pots around, and it's good fun if you're that way inclined like I am. Next photo. And there as you can see, things are starting to fill up a lot more. Conifer, it's a bad photo of Conifer. She looks overweight in it. She's certainly not overweight. But so we've got to still keep this pathway, but you can see that things are really filling out now. In the bottom right-hand corner is sweet corn. We can't grow sweet corn out in the vegetable garden because we have problems with badgers. But I've got around that by growing it in the kitchen courtyard because they can't get in there. And a friend Kyle in the States sends me seeds, and it does very well. It's in a big fabric bag, a root pouch bag, and it works very well. Next. And there you can see the sweet corn in the high summer on the right-hand side of the photo, and it's producing seed. And most of the things in the kitchen courtyard, the aim is always that it's an edible area. But I do have things for pleasure, things like the carnations, evening stock, those sort of things that are dear to me. The scents remind me of different things. So it's nice to have those in an area as well that you're going through. But you can see there's always got to be that path to get the wheelie bins out and to get down into that heating chamber. Next. And originally it came about because I had leftover seedlings. We raise all our own seeds in a John Innes mix for the vegetable garden, and I had lots of extras, and I thought, well, I might as well start planting them up into pots. And that's how, so most of my stock comes from leftover seedlings that I've grown for the vegetable garden. And so it's very seasonal what I'm planting. They'll often be much faster in the pot because they've got that microclimate that you don't get out in the vegetable garden. Next. And you've got to also grow for pleasure. One of my great pleasures in life are violas. I think they're absolutely charming. My argument for growing them is they are edible, but how could you eat a face that looked that sweet? But I do use things like chards and all those sort of things that are very strong architectural plants that give interest. You can see on the right-hand slide, there's 2 lots of chards with very strong, even the stems are strong coloured. So for me, that's really important. And to also have fun with the pots. The one on the left-hand side is a vintage French ceramic pot, and on the right there's different terracotta ones and some more ceramic ones. So mixing and matching, and you saw earlier there was a photo of a photo with a pot shaped like a dachshund, which obviously goes very well with the great Dixter. Next, please. And I think it's really important for these areas to use them because you make them beautiful. And this is a photo of Coralie. She was a Chanticleer student a couple of years ago. I can't remember how long, Bill will know. But that's her and I. We often work in the nursery together. And this is her and I sitting in the kitchen yard having lunch. And I think that's part of the joy of making an area beautiful. You're drawn out there to enjoy it. So if you're going to do this, make sure you are going to use it and enjoy it because it is worth it. So that's me finished. Thank you, David.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for listening in and having us. So I want to introduce you all to the vegetable garden at Chanticleer and just give you an overview of how I take care of the vegetable garden. It's one of the areas that I'm responsible for. And just some little things that we're doing a bit differently this year in the garden as well. So next slide, please. So this is the vegetable garden at Chanticleer as it currently looks at the moment. So welcome to the vegetable garden. The next slide, please. There we go. So just to give a bit of context, the Chanticleer as a garden as a whole was originally the estate of Mr. Rosengarten. And it was his vision for the estate to become a public garden after his passing. So historically, there was always a vegetable garden on the property, you know, provide food to the residents. But when the property became a public garden, the vegetable garden was oriented in its current location. Next slide. So it was oriented in its current location, where it is today, what you'll see. And the vegetable garden maintains that spirit, I think, of the property as a former estate, but it's been adapted to a public garden setting where the purpose is to be a productive space, because that's what vegetable gardens are, I think, first and foremost, but also being educational for our guests, being inspirational, as well as aesthetics. We are a public garden after all. We like to do things with flair. Next slide, please. Taking a while.
Just taking a moment to advance here.
That's good. We'll take it all in, the view. Just another shot of the vegetable garden as well. I think we can move forward. Or sorry, we'll stay here. So I think you know, the best way to show people how to keep a vegetable garden is by doing it. You know, just making it a productive space. So I have 3 main seasons throughout the year of croppings that I do. So I'll have a spring crop, summer crops, and fall crops. You could switch it to the next slide, please.
Do you want to comment on the trellis there, what that is?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this is actually my spring crop, as I said, as it currently is. So just various spring things going on at the moment. And the trellising that you see in the background is actually pea staking. So pea is a great spring crop, almost exclusively spring crop in our area. So to give it something to climb up, because peas are climbers, I repurpose branches that we will do winter pruning on in our trees over the winter time. So I'll just use those branches, I'll stick them in the ground, and I do my own pea staking. So it gives it a piece something to climb onto. It's a material that's readily available for me to use in the garden. And it can be quite ornamental as well. These are beech branches that I'm using. You can see some of the buds actually broke, so you can see a little bit of bronze foliage coming out there. But I think, yeah, I do have a better slide of that. So these are the peas as they were last year when they start to produce. So I rotate crops through the months as I harvest and as the season changes. Next slide, please. So this is something that I plan for throughout the season. So in the wintertime, I'll actually create a sow and harvest schedule of everything that I'm going to grow throughout the season. And I can time my crops from spring through to summer through to fall based off of when I need to be harvesting that crop, and then what space that becomes available as a result of harvesting that I can then start successioning my next crop, either a second spring or summer or fall crop, or a crop from summer into fall, and so on and on. So I can create a plan throughout the year given that. Next slide. So right now in the spring, I try to make the most of it by starting our spring crops indoors. You can really get a head start that way. So I grow them on in cold frames. We'll start them in our greenhouse, and then we'll grow them on our cold frames. You can see them all waiting to go out into the ground here. So in our cold frames, they can acclimate to the weather, to the cooler nights. They have perfect conditions in the greenhouse. When they come out here, they kind of harden off a little bit. And then I can plant them out directly out into the garden. And I can select the best plants to go out in from there. Next slide. So also the other benefit that I can use my cold frames for is I can actually grow crops year round within them. So I can actually have a winter cropping season in addition to spring, summer, and fall. So some crops I will actually plant in the fall for winter crops for late winter, early spring harvest. So I can have a greater extension of my harvesting throughout the year. So I'll just plant them directly into the cold frames and I can cover them at nights or through the winter time. So another utilization of the cold frames. So this year is a little bit different. It's a little bit different for everyone. Up around the Chanticleer house and terraces, this is the other area that I'm responsible for in the garden. I traditionally do a lot of seasonal beds of rotating annuals, tropicals, and perennials in various combinations. And in a lot of, in my spring display, I do use a lot of spring vegetables as part of my display itself, alongside other ornamentals. They work really well in the spring. I'll use them in my containers and in the beds as well. They provide a lot of color, they provide a lot of great texture in the spring, and they also can handle a light frost, which makes them very beneficial as part of my ornamental display in the springtime. And so this year, we can go to the next slide, please. So this year, I'm doing things a little bit differently. So I'm utilizing a lot of the beds around the Chanticleer house and terraces and containers to grow large crops of vegetables in, that same voluptuous style that I do in my ornamental combinations in that space. So there's a lot of opportunity here where a lot of larger crops that I'm not able to grow in the vegetable garden because due to space efficiencies, a lot of large crops that I wouldn't normally have space for, I can now do out in the terraces and in my display beds. So I have the opportunity to grow really big crops and things. So just some things that are on the docket right now. This is the terraces as they currently are. And I'm getting ready to start planting my summer vegetables into those spaces. So I'm doing things like the arches that you see are going to be tomatoes that we can walk under and have the cherries hanging down. Winter squashes on trellises on the terrace. Hanging baskets of sweet potatoes. And I want to do large sweeps of sweet corn and squashes in the display beds as well. So I normally wouldn't be able to grow crops like this in the vegetable garden due to they're just large crops. So it should be quite fun and a little bit different for this year to play around with. Next slide, please. So in other areas of the garden, the cut flower garden that we have at Chanticleer, we traditionally use it as a cut flower garden. So we'll grow a lot of annuals for weekly arrangements that we'll do all around the house every week. And the cut flower garden this year is now in full vegetable production mode as well. We could go to the next slide. So the next slide is, this is what the vegetable garden looks like, or cut flower garden, excuse me, looks like right now. Where we threw it right into our sow and harvest schedule. We can grow a lot more plants this year. And so I'm working really closely with the gardener in this area to create a sow and harvest schedule for that as well. Let's go to the next slide. Just getting back to the vegetable garden. So I harvest from the vegetable garden every year. It'll be twice a week, every week throughout the entire growing season. We'll go to the next slide, please. And so that has to do with, the successioning goes all the way through the year. So this is my spring crop. Next slide. I have a photo of just an indication of my summer cropping I do. This is probably around July time when things start, summer crops start kicking in. Next slide, please. Again, just an indication of fall crops. You can see the endive on the far left-hand side there. Great fall crop. You can see my winter squashes, my delicata squashes are really starting to kick in. So this is around late fall, probably around August, September time. So I'll just continually harvest whatever is fresh and whatever is ready in the garden. Produce, maybe we'll go to the next slide. All the produce that comes from the vegetable garden, I distribute to the staff at Chanticleer, but I also donate a portion of that produce to local food pantries as often as I can. And anytime that Chanticleer hosts special guests or events in the garden, horticultural events, things like that, I will utilize whatever is in season in the vegetable garden to supply whatever I can towards the meal. So it kind of makes things a little bit more special. This is something I think was a direct inspiration from great Dixter as well. So it's a nice contribution in that way. And that's just a little bit of an overview from me.
Great. Thank you, Aaron and David. The questions are pouring in. From one of our friends at Longwood Gardens, Marnie Conley, we have a question about the huge swings in weather continue to occur. How can we properly protect our vegetables and perennials on these cold nights that are approaching? And we are, Aaron Bertelsen, we're expecting a cold weekend.
We're expecting cold weather on Sunday as well.
So what are you guys going to do to protect your plants?
Nothing.
David?
Well, my theory is I've hardened them off. They're in the ground. They're going to have to get through it. There's too much for me to cover out. So, I mean, it's easy enough to cover a pot display, but it's harder to cover, the outside vegetable area.
Anything to add, David?
Yeah. I think on the whole, I mean, climate change is really affecting how farmers, how gardeners can grow food. So it's kind of like a big overarching theme. And I think, gardeners have to be very adaptable. And I think that's really what's happening right now. We're sort of figuring it out, these weather patterns and how we can work with it. I agree with Aaron in a ways that a lot of my crops, usually with a late cool temperatures, they're usually pretty acclimated at this point. So I'm a little bit, I feel a little bit easier about that. If I do need to cover things, I will. I'll just use like a light covering, a light frost. But then also I think that's something that you can really plan for. If you have crops that you know to be a little bit more cold sensitive or tender, you relegating those crops to, say, container plants instead of in a garden, or putting them in a space that's very easily to cover. And that is a good way to kind of get around that and kind of pre-plan for.
Okay. What do you guys do for large pests like rabbits, deer, badgers, raccoons?
Well, I think in the vegetable garden here, I think step one is identify what exactly the pest is or problem that you're having. There's going to be a different remediation to how you deal with deer versus how you deal with chipmunks. At the vegetable garden at Chanticleer, I have a fence around the vegetable garden itself. At the base of the fence, I have chicken wire, and that actually goes underground. So that keeps rabbits in check for the most part. And then at Chanticleer, I have the added benefit of we have a deer fence around the property itself. Being a public garden, we can't have a beautiful display for our guests and have the added pressure of deer, so we exclude them. So I think anytime you're dealing with a pest in the garden, first identify what it is, and that will determine what your remediation is. But also modifying your environment, your growing environment, to make it less conducive to that pest is really going to be the next remediation. Pests are a tricky thing because what works for me may not work for you, and vice versa. So you really kind of have to try things out, experiment a little bit, and find out what's going to work for you.
Well, my biggest problem in the vegetable garden is badgers, and so what I found useful was taking Conifer out late at night so she can chase the badgers, but also coffee grinds. They don't like the smell of coffee grinds. It seems to dilute the smells that they're looking for of raspberries and other things. So I put those around the tomatoes, and they were quite effective till they got very hungry. And that's the only sort of pest we really have in the vegetable garden at Great Dixter. Thank touch wood. I did have a rabbit a couple of years ago. I named it. I hated it, but I named it, and then it suddenly disappeared. So I don't know what happened to Thumper.
All right. David, there's some questions about soil and what do you do with soil in the ground in your vegetable garden? And do you dig?
Good question. I'm glad that came up because I think soil, when it comes to vegetable gardening, soil is the most important aspect. If you have healthy soil, you have healthy vegetables. If you have healthy vegetables, you have healthy people. You know, it all starts with the soil. So the one thing that I really try to stress a lot is when you're in a vegetable garden or you're keeping a vegetable garden, the importance of developing the health of your soil. So I like to do that a lot by amending the soil every year with compost. I like to do that in the fall. After my fall crops have been harvested and come out, when I'm getting ready for winter time, I'll top dress all my beds with compost. It's a great amender and I can cover the soil over winter time. I also do a lot with, I try to be as minimal tilling as I can. I think it's important to prepare the soil. But try to do it as minimally as disturbing as possible. So I use a broad fork in the fall to just kind of break the soil up. Over the course of a growing season, it can get a little bit compacted. So I'll break that up. I'll do a bit of turning over with my fork and just prepare my soil again for spring planting. That way in the spring, as soon as the ground thaws, because over winter our soil will freeze solid. That's not uncommon in the northeastern United States. I can get right to planting my spring crops and my soil is already prepared and ready. I think the other benefit to that is really defining cropping space versus walking space. Define your pathways and define your growing space. Scott, our turf guy here, he always says for every one guest in the garden, there's 2 feet. So there's a lot of, soil compaction that can happen as a result of just walking through. So by defining your walking space, you're keeping the feet where they need to be, and you can develop your soil and your growing space where it is. So I think that's another key aspects of keeping a vegetable garden and creating space that way.
Well, I went to dig, so I still do the very traditional way of putting compost into the ground every winter, digging it a spit deep into the soil, leaving the soil open, and then I rotivate the soil in the spring. So just as the soil starts to warm up, I get out there with a rotavator and break up those big clods of soil. We're on a heavy clay soil, and I'm very lucky it's been gardened on for over 100 years, the vegetable garden where it is. So the soil is very rich, but as David said, the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. So for me, winter digging is a very important part of the garden, and keeps my body in check as well, which is always useful.
There's one question that I want to highlight as well and ask you both. If you were starting a new veggie garden, what kind of soil would you use?
I think work with what you've got. Just develop your soil. If you're starting out and you're not really sure what you've got, getting a soil test is really important. It's a great place to start. It'll tell you what kind of soil you have, what sort of nutrition or lack thereof you have in there. It gives you a good basis to work off of. And I think work with what you have. Start with providing the best growing environment that you can. And like I said, try to be developing that then, composting, turning your soil over, and just keep working at it.
For me personally, I think soil preparation is the most important thing for gardening, whether it be decorative or edibles. If the soil's bad, it's gonna be a hell of a job. So I think it's really important to focus on the soil first, get that right before you even think about the plants. And so do the things that David's just said to do, but soil prep is worth the effort. And often for both climates, it's in the autumn.
Yes.
A couple of our listeners have not tried fruit trees in containers. So they're wondering about how do you go about that, and what trees would be best.
Well, I've got a big collection of fruit trees in pots, and nowadays you can get a lot of different varieties that are on dwarf rootstock, so they're not going to get big. They'll have the same size fruit, but they won't get the same size plant. So on the labels, it's either going to say dwarf or patio, and so that's what you. And there's so much variety. There's apple trees, apricots. I've got apples, apricots, peaches, nectarines, figs, and then soft fruit, of course. So the important thing is to get things that are suitable for pots, and that's going to be on dwarf rootstock.
Anything to add, David?
No, I think growing fruit trees in pots like what Aaron's doing, I think it's just fun. You know, it's a fun way to kind of diversify and to try things out, and even for space efficiency. I think two crops that I really like growing, trees I like growing in containers, figs, as well as citrus. These are things that I'll just put in a permanent container. I'll bring them out during the growing season, and they'll produce, you know, they'll grow and produce, but then I'll bring them in. They're essentially house plants over winter time. But they're two crops that wouldn't normally be able to grow outside in our climate. So by bringing them in, I can potentially get a fig harvest. And even just with citrus, I think the fun aspect is bringing them inside when they start to bloom. You know, they add a lot of fragrance to the house, but then also they can produce really well. Meyer lemons work really good. A really good starter citrus to grow in containers, and are really conducive as well.
Great. We have a question from a classmate at Q of classmate of Aaron's, Andrea Bersendorf. She has transplanted to the United States from Europe and is missing the bitter greens of for summer and winter salads. What would you recommend besides radicchio and endive, and any advice on growing them and then blanching endives in containers to get ready for autumn?
Okay, so well, there's a huge amount. All my salad crop seeds come from the States, and there's a huge, you know, there's rockets, there's mizunas, there's all sorts of interesting bitter flavors. I grew my chicory. I've got plug plants now which will go out next week, and they'll grow their roots through the summer, and then in the autumn I'll lift them and take the tops off and put the roots into a pot, and I keep them actually in the kitchen yard in the oil tank room with a rhubarb forcer over them, and they've been very successful. The thing you've got to watch for that is you don't get slugs in there. They will use it as a hotel if they find it, so keep an eye on slugs, but you can get organically approved slug pellets that will keep them away, and you can just put them around the outside, so it's not going to affect the crop. But David will have better ideas about winter crops as a local.
Yeah, as a local. No, I think as a fall crop, endive is a really wonderful crop. It grows really good in the winter, in the fall, all the way through to winter. I'll actually use it as a wintertime crop for an early spring harvest. That works really well. First time this year, I'm growing Italian dandelion as a spring crop and as a fall crop to try that out. But then also, you know, radicchio works really well if you have the space for it. It needs a bit of a longer growing season. From the summer in through to the fall, it's a really good one to add. When it comes to blanching endive, I found that to be a little bit tricky. I've experimented with that a lot. Cloching it in the fall can be done. The trick in our climate is it can still be quite hot when you want to start cloching it. So I've tried using terracotta pots or cloches. I've just used these pots with a cork in the end. and close them that way. It can be really tricky because there's a lot of heat gain that you can have throughout the day, and you can very quickly end up with mushy endive as a result. I've also tried in the fall just wrapping the plants together, just binding them up with string or rubber bands. That worked a little bit better to have a little bit better airflow, keep the temperatures down to keep the center from getting too hot and rotting out. So those are two things that I've tried. If I would do it again, I would keep wrapping. But then I've also found that, you know, blanching them by covering them in the fall, as well as just leaving them open and to green and harvesting both, I've found them both to be successful and flavorful. So I sort of actually started steering away from blanching my endive in the fall, just because it became a little too difficult. Not being aware of what the temperatures are, because it can still be quite hot getting later into the season. So it was a little bit trickier to get it that way. And I think my unblanched endive has been delicious in the fall. So I tend to just sort of leave it be.
How about pests, insects and diseases? Since these are, you're both growing food that we want to eat, we don't want to be adding more poisons to our life. So what do you recommend for pest and disease controls?
Well, I think for me, it's starting off with good growing conditions. If you provide really good growing conditions for your vegetables, you have really healthy vegetables that are going to produce well, and they're also going to best be able to ward off pest and disease attacks. So I think step number one is just grow a healthy plant, and a lot of that has to do with ample sunlight, really good airspace between plants, both within the row and between rows. Utilizing crop rotations, and then just with diseases, just keeping notes from year to year, identifying what diseases or pests that you might encounter from one year to the next, and then being as proactive as you can. I keep notes every year from year to year in my garden, and I will do a lot of cultivar selections of certain crops that I know to be very prone to certain diseases that I have in the vegetable garden. So with really common ones like cucumbers with tobacco mosaic virus, or basil having a lot of mildew issues. So I'll select cultivars of that that I know to be very resistant to those, and favor those in the vegetable garden as sort of like a preemptive thing. So if you just kind of take notes of what you got, you can sort of preemptively start to address a lot of your issues that way.
For me, our biggest problem is slugs, and what we do is we use organically approved slug pellets. And like David said, I think if you keep the garden clean and not have bad circulation, you don't get a huge pest problem. Some of the crops that we can't plant, potatoes, tomatoes, or brassicas in the same place. They've got to be rotated through. So I know where they were last year, and I'll rotate them through so they're on different soil. And for the other pest we get is cabbage whitefly, butterfly, and I use a net. I just net them for that, so we don't have to use any chemicals. So that's the best protection for them.
Great. We have a question from Harnik Singh, a friend of ours from Wave Hill in the Bronx in New York, who also studied at Great Dixter. He's wondering what's the best time to grow ginger in New York City, and I'd say be in most areas of people listening. And because David showed some fresh harvested ginger tubers that prompted the question. And then what do you start with? Can you just buy some ginger in the grocery store and plant it, or should you do something else?
Right. Ginger is a fun crop. It's something I've been, it's starting to gain a lot of popularity amongst local farmers, small scale farmers, as a really great crop for farmers markets and things like that. So it's gaining a lot of popularity, and I've been experimenting with it a lot. You can, essentially you can just buy ginger hands from a grocery store. I don't like to do that. There's a lot more sources that you can find actual hands of ginger from. One of my best sources comes from Hawaii, actually, biker dude in Hawaii, who sells organic ginger starts. And it can be good fun. So you're gonna get your hands in. For ginger to come in to be dormant like that, it has to be 2 years or older in order to go dormant. So they'll be of that maturity when they come in. They're gonna come in the northeastern US. They're gonna come in our winter time. So they'll arrive when you order them in the fall. They're gonna arrive around February time. And as soon as you get them in is when you wanna start them. So you want to plant your hands, you kind of treat it like a bulb, put it in soil, not too wet, not too dry. But the importance is you want them to be in a warm environment. So they need to be around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm trying to think of what that is in centigrade or Celsius. It's probably about like 25 to 27 Celsius. You really want to warm them up, and that's going to initiate germination. So it's going to take about a month, the whole month of February into March, to see actual signs of shoots emerging from those hands. And then once you get them growing, just keep them growing. So keep them inside in a warm environment until all threats of frost have gone away, that you can plant them outside. So mine are in the greenhouse now, starting to grow. And I will plant them out into the garden probably around June time, because that's when I know that it's sufficiently warm outside. The soil is sufficiently warm, and my night temperatures are sufficiently warm. So it's a bit safe. And then I'll just get them growing in the garden as quick as I can. They really like the heat. They like adequate moisture, same as any other kind of summer crop. And usually you can harvest them at any time. Usually around the end of July is probably when I'll start to pick at them. And you just slowly just harvest them piece by piece. You kind of lift and divide pieces off as you can. And so what the ginger is going to do is, from that original hand, it's going to send out new pups, essentially new hands that are going to grow. And that's called baby ginger, because it's within that first 2 year period. So it doesn't actually go dormant. So the ginger that you grow in that first year is something that you can harvest and enjoy that season, but it actually is something that you need to eat fresh as well. So you'll see that in farmers markets that same way. I quite like it. I think baby ginger, it's less stringy, it's a little bit more fragrant. It's a fun thing to grow yourself. I've seen a lot of farmers growing them under polytunnel, and that's just to keep the heat up, to keep them growing a lot healthier. But it's really, the key is starting it early and keeping it warm to get it out into the garden as you can. And then it'll go all the way up until the first frost. You can overwinter those hands then if you bring them in. But if you're like me, you just harvest them all because you're enjoying it. And then I'll start anew again in the next year.
I don't actually grow ginger, but I've got some sprouting down in the kitchen, so maybe I'll put that in a pot and I'll let you know how it does.
Yeah, I've done them in containers really successfully as well. So
yeah.
So Aaron, we got a question about one of my favorite plants, rhubarb. Do you have a favorite rhubarb recipe?
Absolutely, rhubarb gin. Which I'm in full production at the moment. Rhubarb's doing very well for us now. And so the best thing to do is rhubarb gin, and you use fresh rhubarb and a little sugar and a lot of gin. You leave it for 4 to 5 days, and then you take it out. And with the rhubarb that's been in the gin, then you can make a full with. And then you drink the gin neat as a side to your rhubarb full and shortbread. So that would be my favorite pudding at this time of the year.
Okay, and I have no idea what you said you make the rhubarb with. Is that a fool?
Yes.
And you're not just talking about having drunk the gin and become a fool. What is a fool?
That's less. A fool is a pudding that's it's double cream whipped, and then you fold in you cook down the rhubarb and with a little lemon juice, and you fold it into the whipped cream and put it in the fridge. And then it's a cream pudding. Most puddings in this country are based on double cream and so it's perfect with some straight gin on the side.
Perfect. I think I'll have that for lunch.
Perfect lunch.
Soil in containers. Can you just dig soil from your garden and throw them in the containers?
My answer is no. I use John Innes, which is a recipe started by a man called John Innes. I use John Innes #2, which is a combination of loam-based soil with some sort of peat-like substance and some grit. The problem with soil straight from the ground, it'll be too heavy and it won't drain. So for me, anyway, in our clay soil, we make up our own soil for the pots.
And David?
Yeah, no is my answer as well. Soil in the ground will act differently from soil in containers. So anytime you're growing vegetables or anything, for that matter, in containers, you need to use a container mix. So there's a lot of container mixes out there that they tailor specifically for vegetables. So really it comes down to whatever your preference is. But so I tend to use a lot of those mixes in my own containers. We started doing our own mixes here at Chanticleer, where we've experimented with using our own compost as part of that, and then lightening it up with bark and other aggregates to add better drainage. So really it can be whatever works for you. I think any kind of container mix would be good. What's important there then is nutrition of that soil in the containers. So just be aware of that as you're growing your vegetables as they develop.
In the winter, do you empty all the containers? Do you just reuse the soil next year? Brand new soil, clean the containers? What do you do at the end of the season?
For me, depending on what your crop is. So you're obviously not going to take your fruit trees out of their pots, but generally a lot of the pots a lot of the crops are finished in the autumn, so empty them out. I put new soil in spring, so I use new soil, and I empty the pots out and brush them out and leave them in the outside loo till the spring when I need them again. So I've got a big store of them at the moment, and I'll put new soil in as and when I need the pots.
And David, you're about the same?
Same, yeah. I think it's important, especially with growing vegetables, just cleanliness. So I'll replace the soil every year from my containers, just to reduce any potential disease issues that may persist. So I won't repurpose my soil from year to year. It's good to start fresh, start anew.
Containers. Aaron mentioned several containers in his talk, and David showed some. Does it matter how deep they are? Does it matter what the material is? Any comments on containers?
Well, of course it does. You can't grow a fruit tree in a shallow pot. Depending on what your crop is, my rule of thumb is the shorter time it's going to be in the pot, the less soil it's going to need. That's a very broad rule. An apple tree is going to need a decent sized pot, so the pot should fit the crop. Something like a radish will grow in a relatively shallow, in a wooden crate very easily. So with some of the salad crops, lettuces and things, which have a short time in the soil, but depending on the crop, how long they'll need, how much soil they'll need.
Yeah, I agree with Aaron. It's all about just understanding what growing requirements your crop is, how big it's going to get, how much space it's going to occupy, and then modifying your container based off of that. And I think just like in general, the larger the pot you have, the greater amount of root space that you have, the greater amount of watering that it is. So smaller containers, the less root space they have, the less available nutrients that there is, and the more you're going to have to water it, the more prone to drying out it is. So there can be some benefits there in choosing pot sizes. If you're a forgetful water, it might be good to go with a larger container because it won't dry out as quickly. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, containers are fun, and they're meant to be fun. So it's whatever choice you have, and just knowing what you have and what plant you have, and then working with that and modifying from there.
How about light conditions? Some people don't have full sun conditions. Can they grow anything if there's less than full sun?
Absolutely. I'm on the northeast side of the house, so I don't get much afternoon sun at all. And the windows on the kitchen side, on the slide that you can see on the right-hand side with the sweet corners, you can see how many big leaf crops don't want the full sun anyway. So, and you know, things like lettuces, salads, all that prefer a shadier side anyway, and they're going to dry out less. So there's a lot of crops, rhubarbs, and even sweet corn did fine for us on that side of the house, and there was no problem. So for me, there's a huge amount. Slightly shady is probably better because it doesn't dry out as much.
David?
Yeah, I think there's benefits to any growing situation with shade. It's definitely possible. You know, the leafy crops in general tend to do better in a shadier location. I just think anytime you're growing in shade, you know, most vegetables tend to prefer full sun exposure. So if you're giving it a little bit more shade, you're just going to have to just keep in mind the fact that they're a little bit less vigorous as what they're going to be in full sun. So they may be slightly more susceptible to pest or disease because they're a little bit slower growing, which is perfectly fine. But just keeping that in mind of your growing environment, and then just working with that, and you know, try it out, see what works for you.
Any advice to someone growing on a balcony, a small balcony?
Have fun. I lived in Jerusalem for a few years, and I just had a windowsill to grow on, which I shared with a pigeon. And there's lots you can do. You know, it's when space is limited. I think the most important thing to think about is what would you enjoy growing most, and what would you enjoy using most? For me, it would be something like sorrel. That's something you can't get in a shop easily because it doesn't keep well. So something like that, crops that I would really enjoy, I would grow. But there's lots that you certainly can. And if it's a sunny, hot balcony or windowsill, then all the Mediterranean plants are going to do fantastically well. Always think about pollution and wind, though, when you're on the end pigeon.
Yeah, and the question also does involve wind, because balconies often are very windy. Yeah. Any extra advice on that?
You're going to have to stake and support the plants, but grow plants that are adapted for those conditions, which there's a lot of.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Sturdy pots, and just work with the environment you've got. I think there's a lot of cultivars that are being developed now specifically for growing in containers, so you have a lot more options. I really quite like a lot of growing herbs in containers. A lot of the Mediterranean ones, like Aaron was saying, are pretty conducive to being on the drier, warmer side, and do quite well in pots. And I also find things like that are most handy to have on a deck or on a patio. Because usually when you're using herbs and things, you really just need a small handful or a small clump as you're cooking. So you just run out, snip off what you need, and run back into the kitchen and finish up. So I find a lot of herbs to be the handiest things to have in containers by a convenient location to your kitchen, rather than running all the way out to your vegetable garden.
Aaron, what's the most gratifying vegetable you grow?
Oh, God. Well, it used to be lemons because they are hard work. for us anyway, because winter in them is a problem. They look fantastic in a pot, but I'm lucky I've got Mrs. Next Door's summer house, which she heats well, so I can move them there. But I suppose the thing I'm most enjoying is either sweet corn or eggplants. I think because they look freaky. Eggplants are so, the way these black things hang down in a pot is just mesmerizing. So that's my thing.
David.
Well, I think Harnick hit the nail on the head with ginger, hence my long-winded answer there on that. Ginger is like a new fun crop that I've been growing for the past couple of years, but yeah, I might just go with that one. You know, I think whatever is most exciting for me is whatever is happening in the garden as you're harvesting, because I think anytime you're harvesting something from the garden, it's really fun to, you know, tomatoes fresh from the garden, potatoes that you just dig up, I think is probably, depending on when you ask me that question, that's going to rotate throughout the year. And it keeps it really fun that way, I think.
Great. Well, we've only gotten through some of the questions. This has really excited a great deal of interest, I can tell. But you've gotten me so hungry that I'm going to want to go to lunch. And I wish I had some gin, rhubarb gin to go with my lunch. I would like to put in a sales pitch. Both of our speakers have been involved with books. Aaron has written several books, most recently how to, grow fruit and vegetables in pots. And then there's a book on Chanticleer called The Art of Gardening, where we talk about how we grow and design in the garden at Chanticleer. We just happen to have a special deal for you all. If you want to buy both books, or if you want to buy either one, we've got good prices, and we're in good, our prices are competitive with other online merchants named after rainforests. So I'd like to thank David and Aaron very much. Aaron Doherty for making this whole thing work. Joe Rodriguez, also at Great Dixter, has been helpful in the technical part. And both gardens are currently closed due to the COVID-19 virus, but we're all anxious to have these gardens open, and on both sides of the Atlantic, we'll open as soon as we're allowed to do that. This will be available. I think there'll be a link on the Chanticleer website, and we'll also be probably showing it on social media. So give us a couple days to get it up. But if you'd like to review it or share it with friends, it'll be available.
I'd like to say thank you. I'd like to say from on behalf of Great Dixter, to say thank you to Chanticleer for hosting such a fantastic, fun event. And it is VE Day here in England, and we celebrate and acknowledge it very strongly. And it's also Perry's birthday, so it's a busy day for us. So thank you all very much, and have a drink for VE Day or Perry's birthday, whichever you prefer, or both. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.